Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat of Mixdown, mxtwn.com. It's been a few weeks since we've been on the air, and basically I had a journey of sorts that I was undertaking for my family. I ended up driving across the country, and it was a pretty epic saga going from literally one end of America all the way to the other, planes, trains, and automobiles. And here on this week's show, we've got stories for you about the January 6th insurrection, believe it or not, Henry Cavill, Hearthstone, and other fun entertainment news. First off, we're going to start with the world of music and Jon Schaffer, guitarist and founding member of the band Iced Earth. Now, Jon Schaffer has come down in infamy in history as being one of the first people in the doors at the Capitol on the January 6th insurrection. Now, Jon Schaffer was a part of the large group of people that stormed the grounds, and in the aftermath of the insurrection and the riot at the Capitol, effectively was arrested and then also pled guilty and became a cooperator. What's news and what's interesting this week, as far as Jon Schaffer is concerned, is that a year and a half on from the point that he started cooperating with federal authorities, he is still cooperating with federal authorities. His charges have not been brought to a close. He has not faced final charges, but at the end of the day, he is still helping and cooperating with federal authorities. What he's providing to them, what level and extent of his cooperation is not currently known at this time, but at the end of the day, he is still helping them in terms of providing information about what led up to the riot, the storming of the grounds, and what he may or may not know about that. Federal authorities are declining to comment in any way as part of an ongoing investigation. Secondly, in sad news, D.H. Peligro, born Darren Henley, known as the drummer of the famed punk band from the 80s, the Dead Kennedys, passed away tragically last week. Now, D.H. Peligro was basically, in the simplest of terms, apparently accidentally fell in his home and suffered a severe head trauma. He passed away not long after, and he was 63 years old at the time of his death. In the world of video games, Hearthstone, for those of you who might not be familiar with it, Hearthstone is what we call a collectible card game. Some of you might know collectible card games in the world of the physical reality in terms of Magic the Gathering or Pokemon or Yu-Gi-Oh! But when it comes to the digital space, there started to be a large crop of games that are trying to emulate the collectible card game mechanics that Magic the Gathering built, but all within video game world. So for computers, PCs, iPhones, and Android phones, there is Hearthstone, which is made by Blizzard Entertainment. Hearthstone has just announced its next expansion release that is a whole new set of cards that expand the features and functions of the game called March of the Lich King. It will be released on 12/6, and it is, no kidding, the 21st expansion of the title as far as new cards that have been added that expand the viability, the different varying approaches to building decks that the game allows for. Included in this new set and this new release will be, of course, a new hero class called Death Knight, which will allow for all kinds of zombie fun. Then over into the world of movies, Henry Cavill, who was known as playing Superman in a lot of the DC Extended Universe films and had, for the last few years, seemed to have halted in terms of playing the character, and has been more recently playing in other films, Enola Holmes, and then, of course, as Geralt of Rivia on The Witcher on Netflix, has announced that he is returning to the role of Superman and will be showed up in a end credit scene on Black Adam that came out just a couple weeks ago. Apparently, this is not just a one-off. We won't go into spoilers about what happened in Black Adam, but he will also be portraying the role in numerous other projects that are not announced to come. And then that brings us to our final story for the week, which is also about Henry Cavill, because in the light of that news and him returning to the role of Superman in the DC film universe, he is also exiting the role of Geralt of Rivia on Netflix's The Witcher. He has continued and completed his shooting for the scenes of season 3, which has not yet been released, scheduled for some time, probably summer of next year to come out, but he will be replaced in season 4 by Liam Hemsworth, who has already been announced and secured to take on the role of Geralt of Rivia. Now, for this week's story, basically inspired by my journey across the country, literally driving from Connecticut all the way through Texas and then taking a train all the way into Los Angeles, I wanted to do a story about space, literally physical space in reality, and ostensibly kind of thread this through a topic that I've seen talked about a lot by people over the last few years, even here in Southern California. Now, back in the days where a lot of edgier music started to become a reality, whatever genres you favored, whether it was punk or goth or metal or electronic or experimental or industrial, there was a large running tide where these places would always have clubs of varying degrees and varieties where people could go to see that music, to experience it, to ultimately hear it. And effectively, that was a commonplace thing. They wouldn't necessarily be the most famous venues in terms of the area, in terms of town, but effectively, there would always be a place that you could go to see these shows. Now, in the last 10 years or so, that dynamic has started to change. And conversations I've had with promoters on and off the record for years has indicated the threat of lawsuits, the fear of reprisal, has made it a harder and harder environment to try to make shows that are of things that are less obvious or that could be potentially more violent or might include a lot of young kids. Nobody really wants to take the risk on a point of legality, right? Famously, the Warped Tour, which was always the mecca of the young punk movement and pop punk movement in America the last 20 years, founded by the legendary Kevin Lyman, ultimately, after the threat of a lawsuit because of someone crowd surfing and hurting themselves, had to completely pull anybody being allowed to crowd surf or mosh at any of the shows. Now, all around America, it's become harder and harder for bands of genres that are in metal vicinities or punk or different things. There's less and less places to play. Now, even here in Los Angeles, there might be a ton of big time venues that are run by major concert promoters, but there are less and less places that where young upstart bands, there's a place that people go to congregate. And effectively, this has become kind of a rising tide, right? Like concert promotion and concert production is a big money business. It isn't something that people usually can just walk up to because it costs a lot of money to staff a venue with a lot of people running it, to have the bar, to have security, to have people working the box office. It has to be a band of a certain level of size, can command a certain ticket price to even become the kind of band that can play most of those shows. So what you have is a diminishing environment where there are less and less people who are able to put on shows or even willing to try of a smaller variety for newer, edgier material. Now, the story I wanted to tell today goes all the way back into my high school years, and right at that age when, everyone is basically coming of age to be old enough to drive, to be able to, have their own driver's license or borrow their parents' car and start to be able to move around the place they live a little bit more. I grew up in rural Connecticut. Wasn't much happening in rural Connecticut. And when we were old enough, we did start going to concerts, but that usually meant going to Hartford or New Haven, maybe to a lesser extent Danbury, to a venue called Tuxedo Junction. It doesn't exist anymore. But some of the really good shows usually would end up happening in New York City. So that means that we were, going to New Haven to take a train into New York and then going to see a show. And by the time the show was over, taking a train over, if you're in high school, that meant you were getting home at 4 o'clock in the morning. Now, one time in Connecticut, there was an event that was affectionately called The Bash. It was actually put on and created by a friend of mine. I'm not going to say his name for the purposes of anonymity here, but let's just call him Jay to make it easy, the letter J. And Jay, in his time, took a lot of time and effort to put together a show for Halloween. He dubbed it The Bash, and then basically went out of his way to try to find bands to play, and including some bands we knew that were people that were from the local scene that we were familiar with, but then also bands from different places. I don't even know to this day how he found them, but sometimes from other places in Connecticut, and even some bands from New York ended up playing. Now, it wasn't much more than like a fireman's rec center, a recreation hall, like your YMCA type place that was possible to be rented. But what was great about it was both indoor and outdoors. There was a stage inside, and there was the ability for people to be able to play. And then there was also a decent size, outside, which I guess you could say was probably more of what was the parking lot. But then, of course, that meant kids were going in and out of the venue, and then effectively were able to kind of go and mingle and talk. Now, there wasn't that many people that I knew coming up that were, very well versed in the counterculture scene. A lot of my friends and I were the kind of people who ranted and raved about metal and industrial music or our counterculture music or alternative music, but we didn't. There's only a handful of us, so we were all there, and the friends that I had and the friends that I kept close, we were all present for the event. But then there was also people from all over the place. Now, in years past, as time has gone on from that show, me and some of my closest friends have talked a lot about that show and its impact on the area, the city, the scene, people we knew. And it became this kind of wonderful little thing where people who had never met each other or had a chance to meet each other all met each other that day. It was kind of like, in some strange way, every counterculture kid in all of Connecticut ended up at this one random show in, a small rural town in the middle of the state. And a lot of those people became friends or started relationships, became boyfriends, girlfriends, whatever the case may be. And a lot of those relationships endured for years and years and years on after that, a long after that, like very awkward time of being a high school person, just trying to be a little bit different. I myself met dozens of people in that one event that were never people I would have been exposed to any other way. And it basically opened up whatever you might want to call a scene, because I mean, how much of a scene can a place like Connecticut even have? But it opened up a whole different environment in terms of what was possible and who knew each other. And then to the extension of that, a cross-pollination of ideas, right? Sharing of different culture, sharing of different music, sharing of different things that people found interesting or appealing. All different kinds of relationships and friendships bloomed up from that event. Now, while some bands, the 2 or 3 bands that we knew played, there was also a couple different other bands that we weren't super familiar with. I believe there was a band called Trike, and then even more hilariously, a band called Ass Spatula, which I believe came from New York and were a pretty crazy, spastic, no means no-esque kind of punk band. Now, at the end of the day, I can't remember a lot of what music was played there, other than it was all fun. I remember one band doing a bunch of Slayer covers. I remember one band trying very hard to play a few different Deftones songs because Deftones Adrenaline had recently come out and they were kind of a new thing in the new metal scene. But at the end of the day, there wasn't really a lot that I'd say, wow, okay, well, that one band was the thing that changed our whole world. This band became our band forever and after forever from that moment. But what was special was the people. And who had a chance to meet, who had a chance to connect and communicate together in that moment. That's what made it so wonderful and kind of special. Now, the economics of it, I'm sure somewhat lost to time, probably a few $100s as far as like a security deposit that my friend Jay paid to be able to put this on and to make sure, nothing about this rec center was destroyed as a part of it. But I mean, when I think back on it, just having the space to be able to do it, where it was even possible, the risks be damned, was monumental. This kind of thing didn't happen often. There might have been 1 or 2 other times where someone took it upon themselves to basically try to make something like this a reality. But then, of course, high school kids start becoming high school age and college age, and they start thinking about college, and then, things change. But it does occur to me that sometimes the most important places where people can congregate are these kinds of things that are not necessarily the average run-of-the-mill place where bands might play and bookers and concert promoters are starting to put on events. There's a certain degree of liability in our country, which is unavoidable, because if you're staging something and, there have been several disasters that are well documented in America at, art house parties that have led to people passing away, and then the liability that the building owners have for that. So there are certain liability questions that obviously have to be navigated, because you can't risk being sued for millions of dollars because somebody came and caused trouble and then something went really bad. But at the same time, it is a criminal shame that this kind of thing isn't more readily accessible in our world. That it's so hard in our current society just to have a place, a space where people can go to be able to congregate and to be able to experience these different kinds of things together and to try doing something new. I mean, what's great about all concerts and all musics in general and all bands playing shows and tours is that it's a communal way for us all to meet, and we all basically have a shared enjoyment in that moment, whether we're singing along together or dancing. Something about that is really incredible. But even more special is when it's something a bit below that radar, a bit underneath that obvious average thing, which is mass market radio or streaming services or what's synced in major movies. I mean, the same opportunities afforded The Weeknd are not afforded a tiny little band that's just getting going, that might be trying really hard just to do something fresh and innovative, or maybe people in just one little place that are trying to make a little bit of a community about making art themselves the way that they think they need to. That's become a harder and harder environment in our current world. Now, as I drove across America, and the funny thing about driving across America, when you're trying to get from point A to point B, and you're not making intentionally touristy stops at different places all over the country, and you're not going to this obvious major city and that obvious major city, the thing that's unusual about it is that most of the road from a major place like, say, Connecticut or New York all the way through Texas is literally nothing but a road lined by two sides of trees. And you basically don't see much in the way of signage, much in the way of notice, much in the way of come here, do this. Now, of course, there's an inherent overpopulation problem in many places in our planet, and major metropolitan city centers all over even this country are overflowing with people, and the horror stories of how hard it is to buy a house or to afford to buy a house. That's happening all over America right now. But then, on the other hand, there's nothing but space. You look at this country from a different perspective, and you're not in those obvious megalopolis, of the New York South, Northeast, or the Southwest between San Diego and Los Angeles, or maybe in between Dallas and Houston and Austin and Texas. There is an incredible amount of unused space in this country. And I'm not making an argument for deforestation, let's tear down all the rural country areas or anything like that. But inherently, the inability to have something that allows for young people or any kind of people who are just a little bit less than what is an obvious mainstream have a concerted way to be able to go and experience these things, especially when they're of a counterculture variety that isn't the obvious, trendy, simple thing. It's a shame that there isn't more of an ability to be able to make this possible for people. It's an incredible silliness to me to think the kind of thing that we're like, oh, that was neat. Someone spent a few $100s and rented a rec center, and then a whole bunch of cool bands played, and look at all the cool stuff we were able to experience, even if the bands weren't all that great, even if the bands weren't going to last 20 years and become an arena sellout. Just the fact that it happened felt immensely special. And it's incredibly silly to me looking back on it all that now that's become something of a myth. It's become something of a more unrealized thing that just is a lot harder to make happen, that a lot fewer people are willing to risk at. And of course, not to mention, we won't even go into the economic side of it, where there is the notion that concert promotion in general is just a totally losing money business, that someone would have to do this almost benevolently, risking money just to basically probably get nothing back, if maybe at best, to recoup what they fronted to try to put it on. At the end of the day, this kind of thing and these kind of communal experiences as a way for like-minded, diverse people to meet, to share ideas, to learn, to grow, to not feel so trapped in places where everyone is something a lot more common, average, and, unsurprising, are as pivotal as anything could be. And at the end of the day, there should be some way to be able to do this with some measure of ease without the inherent fear of being sued to oblivion because someone tragically passed away or some accident happened. There has to be some kind of way to keep this kind of thing going, because not only do kids need some way to be able to communicate, share stories and experiences, learn and grow from each other, but then also to that end, it's also a big, breeding ground for what becomes new and exciting music in terms of just what is possible. The only way that we can get really great new things is for people to deliberately try to push the boundaries forward at every opportunity that they can. And to have the ability to do that, to make mistakes, to make bad music, to have the ability to try different things, and to not have to fear that there won't be a place to do it, or how will I do it, or how will I do it without compromising myself. Some loser concert promoter might think maybe we could get put on somewhere. Not everything needs to be about who do you know and what connections you have. On some level, there should be those platforms, as many of them as we can possibly create, to allow people to have that chance to basically just be themselves, to try to be the kinds of art and the kinds of things that they want to do without fear. That's all for this week's episode of This Week is Live. So glad to see you all. Thank you for joining us. And now that that trip is behind me, we'll be having this show at least once a week, every week, hopefully on Thursday every week, usually around this time between 5 and 6 p.m. Please join us. Subscribe here on Twitch. Follow us on YouTube. We'll be posting these on YouTube a few days later after each episode airs, and then we'll be going live here on Twitch probably every Thursday. In time, we'll probably start having some special guests and interviews and different people from Mixdown joining me here. But for now, we'll keep this a recap of the stories that are happening in the world of entertainment that you need to know, and a short monologue just like this one today. Thanks for joining me. Till next time.